Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We know that anti-Asian violence has risen since the start of the pandemic, but the U.S. government has actually now corrected its original data, and the fact of the matter is it's a lot worse than we originally thought. According to the FBI this week, anti-Asian hate crimes jumped more than 73% last year. That's a disproportionate uptick compared to hate crimes in general, which rose 13% in 2020. So our discussion today focuses on the corporate response to this and how the newly created Asian American Foundation will work alongside the business community to combat this rise in violence. So to that end, I want to welcome our esteemed panelists. Joining us from Houston is Sonal Shah. She is founding president of the Asian American Foundation, as well is Jerry Yang from the Bay Area. You know him as the co-founder of Yahoo. He is also founder of Ame Cloud Ventures. Thank you guys so much for getting up early and joining us on this important conversation. Sonal, let me start with you because you worked in the federal government, you've worked in the nonprofit world, you worked at Goldman Sachs. So you've really seen the gamut of different organizations. You started the Asian American Foundation earlier this year. How has the escalation of violence against Asian Americans sharpened this group's mission?
Well, Scarlet, first of all, thank you for hosting this conversation. And this started with Jonathan Greenblatt from ADL coming to actually our board, and Jerry can talk about this, saying we're seeing an uptick in violence against Asian Americans, and we really, what are you all going to do about it? So when we started working on the foundation and we were setting it up, we were doing research, and then we saw the uptick in violence continue to increase, and the numbers are showing it with a 73% increase. And we realized that we couldn't just wait for a strategy. We actually had to launch and really get out there and talk about the violence that was happening. That's why right after Atlanta, we decided that we were going to get launched, and we launched the Asian American Foundation in May with 3 presidents, and obviously a huge interest from the business community, individuals and foundations to really make sure that we are paying attention to what's happening in the Asian American community, to what's happening to Asian Americans. Too often the violence is frankly underreported, and we don't actually talk about it, to make sure we're holding not only government and businesses and community responsible, but ourselves to say, are we making sure we're standing up where we need to and creating a foundation that is looking at belonging and prosperity for AAPIs, 23 million AAPIs in this country, and ensuring that there's no violence, discrimination, or slander against us. So that is why we exist. That is why we are here. And we want to make sure we're standing up for all 23 million of us.
23 million strong, and in fact, the fastest growing minority group in the U.S. as well. Jerry, what has TAAF found when it comes to corporate investment in this community?
Well, thanks, Scarlett. The TAAF's mission, as Sonal says, is to not only look at the anti-Asian hate that gave us sort of the unity and the solidarity to create TAAF, but also the belonging and the inclusion of Asian Americans. And one of the things that really got us in the very beginning is this idea that if you look at the last 5 years, the amount of giving from foundations and corporations that to Asian Americans in the AAPI community has been less than 1%. And so if you imagine that people generally don't think that AAPI community are underserved, but the reality is that while there are a number of Asian Americans across the United States that are doing very well, there's still a vast number that are in poverty, and in fact, the worst social demographics of Asian Americans are doing much worse than the average. So this undergiving gave us the idea of going to corporate America, going to foundations, going to charitable private foundations to really up their giving. And this is part of the giving challenge that TAAF launched in May, which was able to take dollars and resources and in kind from corporate America to be able to devote to Asian American organizations. And the number we were able to raise over the next 5 years is $1.1 billion. This is the number that includes not only direct dollars to organizations like TAAF, but also indirect dollars that company can do inside their own organizations for their DEI work, or or to other organizations. So it's an astounding number, but we're just getting started, Scarlet. I think Asian Americans have been traditionally underlooked in the Asian philanthropy landscape, but also in the giving landscape. And this money is just getting people to go to sort of strengthen their Asian American organizations and start to scale. And so it's an interesting time because we're motivated by the anti-Asian hate work, but also really gratified by the unity and solidarity we're seeing.
Yeah, less than 1% from companies, and Sonal, I believe about half of 1% from foundations. So to get foundations and companies to increase their investment, spend more, a lot of what you work on at TAF is education. What do you spend the most time explaining? Is it the history of the API community in the U.S., our diversity of our origin countries, and who do you find needs that education the most? Is it people in the community? Is it people outside the community, the executive branches, or the executive core, the core executives, I should say?
Yeah, we find that government, business, and outside of our own community, other communities need education about the community. There's a lot of misperceptions about our community. So one, as Jerry mentioned, that we are wealthy and that we don't have a dichotomy amongst our communities. So in fact, the highest disparity in income is amongst the Asian American community. Across all communities, the highest disparity is in the Asian American community. Two, recognizing that the AAPI community is American. Too often we have a perception that we're the perpetual foreigners. We're not American. And reminding people that we are American. In fact, Asian Americans have been in the United States since the 1800s, and recognizing that the history of America includes the Asian American community. And the final is that we are over 40 ethnicities, 20 Pacific Islander communities. And while we are a diverse set of communities, even within the AAPIs, we have a lot of commonalities, and that there's a lot to be done. So not to be overlooked and ensure that we're there. So government too often doesn't think about the languages in the Asian American community. When we think about language translation, investments that need to be made, we don't disaggregate information about AAPI. So we put AAPI as a lump sum category. But when you think about who actually is being affected, it's important that we disaggregate that information. And in business and organizations, sometimes we forget, we don't even think about the AAPI populations because, oh, we're like, well, it's 20% of the population in many companies, but we don't even think about it because they're there, but we don't think about what's happening to them, and the fact that AAPIs are not being promoted. Our communities are not being promoted at the rates of other communities. So recognizing that AAPIs are here and that we need to educate people about who we are and what our issues are.
Okay, well, right now, as I just mentioned, the FBI has given us new data that show that the incidents of anti-Asian hate have actually been a lot larger than what we had known up until this point. There are definitely fewer headlines, but there's still plenty of incidents. And I know that TAF is involved in the collection of data and making sure that we are keeping track of what's happening. We have a question from the audience here, and Sonal, I'll direct it to you. Based on all the work that TAF is doing and Stop AAPI Hate, which is one of your grantees, is working on, do you have any information on the current causes of specific violence against the Asian American community?
So the particular violence against the Asian American community right now is coronavirus. And the fact that, our past president talked a lot about Kung Fu virus, all of that didn't help that it started to target a community that has been living in the United States, working in the United States, and talking about that. And that has increased violence amongst the Asian Americans, not just the Chinese American community, the Filipino American community, the Korean American communities, but across the board, it's affected our communities. So the largest amount of violence has been that. The second part is the anti-China rhetoric and recognizing that we may talk about a government, but let's not hold everybody and people accountable to what a government might do, and that is translating to affecting Asian American communities in the United States. So the violence is coming from multiple ends, but we have to be careful about how we say things and what we say, and it affects our children and college students too. It's not just the elderly and in Chinatowns and other places, but it's having an effect in schools, it's having an effect in college campuses, and it's important that we recognize that.
So I mentioned Stop AAPI Hate, which has been tracking the number of incidents of anti-Asian hate. Jerry, we are in a world that reveres data. You are comfortable in that world of data as well. Collecting data on hate crimes we know is paramount, but walk us through how having that data moves the needle, because I look at the world of ESG, the environmental, social, and governance, and climate change, and the financial industry is obsessed with tracking data, with monitoring data, and measuring the data, and there's any number of sources for that information. But all that data, the aggregation of it, the slicing and dicing of it, the analytics it drives, it has somehow replaced action, or it can replace action. I worry that that's what's going to happen here. How do you think about that?
Well, you nailed it. I think getting data is just the beginning, but really translating data into insights and translating insights into action is really where we need to head. And I think the reason that there is a fascination around anti-Asian hate data right now is that there hasn't been any of it before. This is, just something that nobody really tracked in the past. And so one of the work that TAF is trying to do is really build a foundation and a platform for being able to have kind of a longitudinal study over time to be able to understand what is going on. So not only are we partnering and helping funding people like Stop AAPI Hate, which is doing great work. We at TAF also have our own tracking of what's going on social media. So primarily Twitter, but also other sources where we just observe. We're grabbing things off of the internet. And so while you talk about anti-Asian hate crimes from the FBI, these are documented crimes. We also sense sentiment. We also sense incidents, things that don't become crime or not classified as crime. We have just seen that number have gone up. We've gone from sort of like Sonal said, rhetoric and incidents into increasingly more violent and more direct hate actions against Asian Americans. So being able to really first understand that baseline data, whether it's through our Twitter data or through Stop AAPI Hate or through survey data, which have been launched, and then we're also doing commissioning a more foundational study based on the 2020 census with the Pew research. These are things that we're going to need to be able to just understand our community better. Where are things happening? Who's that happening to? Is it within the community? Is it from outside the community? And then being able to take that kind of data, translate into insights, and translate into education initiatives, translate into narrative change, and then of course translate it into anti-Asian hate kinds of actions. For example, the Action Center that Sonal launched last month, where we're working with local community partners, or we're working with local companies, or we're working local governments to be able to respond to any dramatic hate incidents, for example. So being able to translate that data into insights, into action, is really what TAF is focused on.
Okay, so that's the sequence here. So Sonal, I'm going to kick it over to you. Tell us a little bit about the action centers and the specific actions that you have put in place at TAF with some of the companies that you work with.
So the action centers are in 3 cities right now. We're piloting in New York City, in Oakland, and in Chicago. And each of these action centers is focused on collecting data, protection of communities, response where response is needed, and helping people get access to the services that they need. And that's important because, and we're working with local governments there, we're working with local companies in each of these cities, and we're working with local activists or organizations there to make sure that there's a full wraparound service around when an incident happens. But while there's also what happens with incidents, these action centers are also focused on prevention. How do we work with companies? How do we work with government? How do we work with local community organizations to ensure that communities don't have to go through that? So we're not just dealing with incidents as they happen, but addressing them before they happen. So the action centers, we hope to expand these action centers and do it in more cities. But we started with these 3 cities because we knew where the incidences were high, and they continue to be high in each of these cities, and where we know that we have strong partners and we want to learn. So as we learn, we can adapt and expand along the way.
I have a question from the audience, and I'm going to direct it to Jerry. One of the audience members, Jerry, wants to know, in what way should AAPI data be aggregated? Should it be by region? Should it be by country of origin? What would you suggest?
Well, I think the way we look at data, especially on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, is really as a inside the United States, looking inside the American community, and the kinds of things that we're really trying to understand is, for example, not only among sort of the well-known ethnic groups of sort of the South Asians or the East Asians, but if you look at Southeast Asians, there's a large Southeast Asian community, whether it's the Hmongs or the so the Cambodians or Vietnamese. There is a huge number of Filipino Americans. They're starting to be obviously Asian Americans of different religions, and being able to segment those and understand whether religion plays in a role in sort of our work, which obviously it does. And then really there is a lot of inside the Asian American API understanding and study of where do we all live, what are the social geographic and social demographic data, but it's really, Scarlet, none of this is rocket science. It's really just basic sort of societal and communal understanding of who we are. This is what you probably would do in any community, and so we're just getting started there. And insights are quite telling. We're finding out about what we know about ourselves, and then our interactions with other races. Those are important as well. So we're hoping to be able to talk a lot more about that in the coming months.
It speaks to the fact that there was such little data to begin with, that collecting this data tells so many stories. Sonal, give us some specific examples of companies that are spending money and taking actionable measures beyond paying lip service and saying that we stand beside our API colleagues, we wish them well, we condemn this violence against this community.
Well, I hate to pick on any one particular company because we have so many of them partnering.
Let's highlight.
Let me give you 3 examples. So Bank of America is a great partner with us, and they have made a big commitment to equity. And we are a partner with them in looking at which communities that are being most affected where Bank of America operates, and how can we make sure that communities are being affected there. McKinsey is running an institute on Asian American leadership. As I mentioned, the promotion of Asian Americans in companies is very limited, and so we wanted to make sure we were working with Asian American leaders. So McKinsey is running an institute. They've already put 1,000 leaders through that institute, and they would like to do 10,000 to make sure that we are investing in Asian American leadership. On the tech side, we have companies like Zoom that are working with us and helping our nonprofits get access to accounts, or to be able to understand how they could use Zoom more effectively for the work that they need. So we have many companies that are doing this, but these are just 3 great examples of companies that have really stepped in to really be partners with us.
And I'm glad to hear about Zoom and the tech industry doing that, but it makes sense given that the CEO is Eric Yuan, who is Chinese American. Jerry, you are based out in Silicon Valley. The big tech firms are the leaders, the corporate leaders. They attract the talent. What more do the CEOs and the founders of those firms need to be doing to play a bigger role in promoting API leadership and belonging?
Well, there's a lot we can do here in Silicon Valley. I mean, you think about some of these big tech companies, or even most tech companies, their Asian American population is, in the 20, 30, maybe even 40% are API. And as you both have pointed out, there's this bamboo ceiling. If you're 40% population are API, if you go into sort of the vice presidents or even the C-suite, often, even though with well-known entrepreneurs and CEOs that are Asian American, often those C-suite and the leadership levels are much less than 10%. And to think or say that Asian Americans are the sort of the workhorse labor force out here in Silicon Valley, not represented above sort of the leadership levels, is astounding. And it's so not only are there leadership training opportunity, promotional training, DEI kinds of things that companies can do, but also I think really we've been doing a lot of, just talking and conversation and dialogue with the employee resource groups, ERGs within all these companies, and being able to fund them properly from either inside the company or from other resources, but also really creating an environment where there is discussion. I mean, we were in one company, and I'll give you a quick example, Scarlet. We were in one company, and they had 9 different ERGs from different parts of cultures and different languages, and the difference between people who are native-born Asian Americans that are doing work versus immigrants, they're very different. And I think people tend to think of us as one sort of monolithic.
Let's get you back up. There we go.
Group. Yeah, sorry, here we go. One monolithic group, whereas really there are many different ethnicities that are being addressed. So I think taking that next level down with ERGs and with companies and creating those dialogues and creating leadership opportunities, that's really where opportunities at.